That would brought ruliness out of unruliness mighty quickly. I'm very impressed. Anyway, we're now convened for Kurt Lash's paper, and you've got 10 minutes, Kurt. Take it away.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks to Mike Rappaport, Mike Ramsey, the whole gang here at the Center for inviting me to talk about my paper on the 1866 Civil Rights Act. I'm especially honored to have John here next to me commenting on the paper. I should start by apologizing for the length of the paper. Don Drips cornered me yesterday. He said, Kurt, it's too long and it needs to be a book. And I think what that means is that even as a book, it's still too long. And I suspect he's right. There's a lot of work. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. This is an early draft of the paper in which I've erred on the side of keeping quotes in their context as much as possible in order to draw out commentary and pushback on some of my use of the quotes where possible. It's a very exciting paper for me to have written. It comes out of earlier work that I've done on the Privileges or Immunities Clause, my study of the 14th Amendment. It's part of a much larger work that I'm putting together on the overall architecture of the 14th Amendment. And it was especially nice to get this out while we're celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Just to set the context, legal historians believe that the Act, the 1866 Act, provides important clues to understanding the original meaning of the 14th Amendment. It was passed by the same Congress at roughly the same time, and advocates of the amendment often claimed that its provisions authorized and incorporated the rights of the Civil Rights Act. But what no one at the time of ratification described with any specificity is exactly why and how the 14th Amendment actually authorized or constitutionalized the Civil Rights Act of 1866. So scholars have had a mystery that they've grappled with for some time. As of today, most scholars tie the Civil Rights Act to the Privileges or Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment. That seems to make some textual sense because both the April version of the 1866 Civil Rights Act and the Privileges or Immunities Clause both limit their protections to citizens. And we have a number of instances of members in the 39th Congress who describe the rights of national citizenship as including the rights listed in the Civil Rights Act. And so scholars have therefore assumed that the Civil Rights Act therefore must have protected rights that were uniquely associated with national citizenship and therefore is uniquely associated with the Privileges or Immunities Clause. But this paper, of course, challenges that assumption. Rather than representing the special rights of citizens, I believe the evidence supports the idea that the Act represented an effort to enforce the right not to be deprived of life, liberty, and property without due process of law. And those are rights that they understood belonged to all persons, including citizens, but not just citizens. However, prior to the passage of the 14th Amendment, Congress arguably lacked power to extend these rights to all persons. However, once the 14th Amendment was ratified, Congress repassed the Civil Rights Act and now extended its major provisions, not all of them, but most of its provisions, to include all persons and not just citizens, and that's something Congress would not have done if they believed that the rights of the Civil Rights Act were somehow uniquely associated with citizenship and the Privileges or Immunities Clause. Now, if I'm right, and the Act was understood as an enforcement of due process rights, then I think this suggests the need to revisit a number of common scholarly assumptions about the Privileges or Immunities Clause, the Due Process Clause, and the Equal Protection Clause, and we can get into that in the comments section if you'd like. Sketching the major arguments, right, you know, and doing so in about 5 minutes, a major strain of abolitionist thought was that slavery could not be reconciled with the constitutional commitment to due process. Even if slaves were not citizens, they certainly were persons and therefore should enjoy the God-given right to life, liberty, and property, same as everybody else. The idea that slavery could not be reconciled with due process and the rights of life, liberty, and property occurred again and again during the debates over the 13th Amendment, and it was possible for members to believe, or at least hope, that the freedmen would automatically receive their due rights to life, liberty, and property once slavery had actually been abolished. The black codes, of course, exploded that hope, and it was clear to the members of the 39th Congress when they met in late 1865 into 1866, that there was going to have to be some kind of additional remedial efforts exerted on behalf of the freedmen in the South. The members divided, however, in terms of what they wanted to do and how they wanted to approach those remedies. One side pursued legislative enactments like the Freedmen's Bill and the Civil Rights Act, while another group, which included John Bingham, pursued the avenue of constitutional amendment. The Freedmen's Bureau Bill and the Civil Rights Bill were introduced at the same time, and they protected the same category of rights and extended those rights, rights relating to contracts, sue and be sue, lease and hold property. They extended those rights to all inhabitants, at least in the initial forms of both of those bills. And the proponents insisted that both bills could be authorized as an exercise of power under Section 2 of the 13th Amendment. That claim, however, was disputed. And when President Johnson vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, and that was the first one up, when he vetoed the bill, Congress was unable to assemble a sufficient number of votes to override the veto. There were too many doubters about constitutional power. That placed the Civil Rights Act in grave danger. There was worries that it was going to face the same fate as the Freedmen's Bureau Bill. So they amended its original form. Instead of extending it to a protection of all inhabitants, they amended it so it only applied and only protected citizens. That amendment, by targeting citizens instead of all inhabitants, allowed the Act's proponents to rely on a number of constitutional provisions as possible sources of constitutional authority, in addition to those under Section 2 of the 13th Amendment. In particular, House sponsor of the Civil Rights Act, James Wilson, stressed that the Act was an effort to enforce the Fifth Amendment's rights to life, liberty, and property. And that characterization of the Act as protecting those due process rights was made by multiple members of the 39th Congress, and I explore that at some length in the paper. But Wilson's arguments in the House are particularly important because, of course, they triggered the objections by John Bingham. Bingham agreed with Wilson that the Act was an effort to enforce Fifth Amendment rights of life, liberty, and property. However, Bingham had serious objections. First of all, he objected to the amended form of the Civil Rights Bill. The rights of due process belong to all persons and not just to citizens. Bingham also believed that Congress at that point lacked power to protect anyone's due process rights. He insisted that it was going to take a constitutional amendment specifically authorizing Congress to enforce the due process rights of all persons before you could pass this kind of legislation. He therefore refused to support the Civil Rights Act, and instead he pursued his course of trying to get an amendment passed, and in fact he succeeded in doing so. He drafted language which included the Due Process Clause, which extended rights of due process to all persons, and embedded it in an amendment that gave Congress specific power to enforce the rights of due process. Once that amendment was ratified, Congress repasses the Civil Rights Act, and this time they add a section extending almost all of the original rights from the Civil Rights Act to all persons, and this time, of course, Bingham supports the bill. Okay, so that's a general historical picture. As far as originalist theory is concerned, I think there are a number of implications. However, I want to say that I don't develop these implications, and the theoretical and originalist implications in this paper. I think it'll take a second paper and additional work to really flesh it all out. But for the time being, I think that Bingham's argument that the Act represented an effort to enforce the rights of due process deserves to be taken seriously, more seriously than it has been in prior literature. I think there's too much direct evidence in the record suggesting that other members shared the same view for us to discount Bingham as some kind of outlier in this respect. The fact that Bingham so quickly produced an amendment which gave Congress power to enforce due process rights of all persons makes it, I think, highly likely that his fellow members would also view his due process clause as providing constitutional power to pass legislation like the Civil Rights Act. The remaining piece of the puzzle, however, is whether the public would have understood the due process clause as authorizing this kind of legislation, and that's where I need to do more work. Obviously, I'm concentrating in this particular power on evidence that's arising in Congress. I'm an originalist who's looking for original public meaning, and that means I have to move from this set of evidence into an analysis of what was actually happening in the public. How are we doing on time? 1 minute. Okay, well, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. The theoretical implications that need more exploration involve what exactly was their theory of due process? In what way did they understand due process so that it included this principle of equal protection that would authorize the Civil Rights Act? How did they understand the Equal Protection Clause? Did it represent a separate, unique kind of protection, or did it somehow overlap with the Due Process Clause? These are very serious questions that I think need more exploration. But again, I think the fact we've got enough to suggest that there is a due process reading that needs to be somehow reconciled with the Equal Protection Clause. And then finally, as far as the Privilege or Immunities Clause is concerned, I think we can now understand why members so often spoke of the Civil Rights Act as protecting the fundamental rights of national citizenship. The Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause itself represented one of the fundamental rights of national citizenship. And although members commonly describe the rights of due process as natural rights belonging to all persons, of course, those rights were also particularly guaranteed to citizens by way of the Fifth Amendment. There's no reason to think the Privilege or Immunities Clause only protected Fifth Amendment rights, and elsewhere I've argued that I think the Privilege or Immunities Clause represented a reference to all constitutionally enumerated privileges and immunities, and I think the evidence in this paper supports that view, but I'll leave that subject for another day. Thank you.